Again, we like to
I lost the picture there.
David. What's up?
Hi, everybody. I am president of Loyal Scientific Engagement. Tweet is my fellow vice president. Hi, we are all about putting on civically engaging. Hi, welcome to Sunday Police. Nice attention span. We're all about putting like very thought-provoking, politically active presentations and different panels on throughout the year. So you'll see us cheat and plan it and then playing hostess, you know. This is one of our first major ones for the semester. We're going to also have a second one in the next coming week. If you're interested, you can please like us on Facebook. We're Loyal Society Civic Engagement. You can get on our email list, and we can email you out whenever things are coming. And our meetings, we have bi-weekly meetings. So if you have any questions, I'm sure Peter and myself would love to answer.
Alright guys, dimming the lights and
Yeah, I'll fix it.
can you see from the door and turn out the lights?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me on the mic? Put it in the mic. Can you hear me through the mic? Amy, you tell me when to begin. Boss lady? Tell me when to begin. Can start now? Okay, well, welcome everybody. My name is Roger White. I'm currently serving as interim dean of the College of Social Science, and I'm a political scientist in the Department of Political Science and a teacher by trade. Welcome everybody. Before we do anything else, I think we should all give a nice round of applause to Twee, Lee, and Amy Purtle for putting all of this. So we have an amazing panel tonight. I will simply serve as a moderator, so my job is really very easy, and I'm really looking forward to learning a lot. When I was preparing the introductions, I was so impressed by the selection of people on the panel. We have Dr. Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me now? All right. So we have Dr. Josh Shanata, who is a chemist from our Department of Chemistry. Dr. Shanata has a PhD from Caltech, a bachelor's from Cornell College. Dr. Shanata is an organic chemist who specializes in chemical biology. Her lab research focuses on the application of organic chemistry to advance understanding in several fields, one of which is the role of cell membranes and the role they play in modulating how drugs work. I'm very interested in that myself. We're also very privileged to have Dr. Selika Sweet, who has an MD and an FAAFP. I looked this up. That is, she's a fellow of the American Academy of Family Practice. Dr. Sweet practices in Biloxi, Mississippi with the Veterans Administration. As a veteran, I'm especially grateful to her for that. She has her BS from Dillard University. She has her MD from Meharry Medical College in Nashville, Tennessee. She did her residencies at Ochsner Hospital and at LSU Med Center. and she's also done graduate work in chemistry. Dr. Sweet specializes in family medicine, so I'm especially interested in the perspective that she will bring. An old and dear friend of mine, actually, Dr. Capowich, Associate Professor of Sociology in our Department of Sociology. And Dr. Capowich received his PhD at the University of Maryland, College Park. He received his master's degree at the University of South Florida and his bachelor's degree at Providence College. His research interests include the testing of sociological theories on crime and violence. I can see how that will be an important contribution to students. Quantitative methods, research design, and evaluation research. Finally, Skyping to us this evening, way up there in the corner, you can see him up there, is Dr. Mark Thornton. Dr. Thornton is a senior research fellow at the Ludwig von Mises Institute. He is a graduate of St. Bonaventure University, and he receives his PhD in economics from Auburn University. And I'm condensing here just a little of Dr. Thornton's resume is extensive. He has published numerous works in economics, and he has written research and taught extensively on the subject of the prohibition of drugs, as well as other areas of economics and of banking. So having said that, let's give all our panel a nice round of applause. Each panelist will open with a 7 to 10 minute presentation. I will be the timekeeper. I will be moderately liberal if you will get over a little, but not too liberal. And then we'll follow up with questions from the audience. You should have plenty of time to ask questions to various panelists. So you come up here and use the microphone if it's working. If it's working. Hey. All right. So, I would ask you when you come up to make sure these are questions and not pronunciamentos. All right. Having said that, we will now open up with Dr. Shanata.
All right, can you hear me back, Jess? Yeah? All right, so I'll just yell. I'm going to go through the slides fairly quickly. We have a lot of time to talk afterwards, so if you have questions, we'll address them then. And I'm going to begin by talking about chemistry. I'm an organic chemist, chemical biologist, as Dr. White said, about how we represent molecules. We've got protons and neutrons, we've got electrons surrounding them, that's an atom. Atoms come together to form molecules. When we link those together, sometimes people call those chemicals. Those are the same thing. Usually in our bodies, we have molecules with backbones that contain carbon. And those things are like lipids and sugars and proteins. Those are all backbones that are mostly carbon atoms. And as organic chemists, we think carbon first. And so I'm going to show a lot of structures today that use what's known as organic shorthand notation, or line structure. So I wanted to introduce that. Here's butanol, 4 carbons and an OH. Here it is drawn out with all the detailed bonds to hydrogen. And that takes a long time. And so we usually just show it this way, where each endpoint and each vertex is a carbon, which is assumed to have 4 bonds. If only 2 bonds are shown to 2 different carbons, the other 2 are unshown hydrogens. So that's that skeletal formation. So for example, this molecule, which has a carbon-carbon double bond, carbon-carbon single bond, and 1 hydrogen on each of these carbons would be represented like this. This is one you've probably heard of before. It's benzene. Okay, so we'll be seeing a lot of this. Take-home messages for today. I'm going to start off by asserting that smoking is probably not good for you, whatever it is that you're smoking, be it marijuana, be it tobacco, etc. I'm going to say that depending on structure of drugs, they might indirectly impact us, our receptors. They might directly impact receptors by binding there. These are not things that happen only one or the other. They usually happen in some combination. I want to point out that when we talk about legalizing marijuana, we're not talking about one molecule. We're talking about many, all of those found in marijuana. And to say that when it comes to synthetic marijuana or synthetic cannabinoids, the only way to know what will happen in a person is to actually test it. So let's start by talking about smoking. Here's an artist's rendition of someone smoking, and in that cigarette smoke, we've got a whole bunch of different molecules. One of them is nicotine, and it interacts with certain receptors in the brain. Now, smoking is running an awfully dangerous reaction, it seems to me. You're burning things. The kinds of things that you're burning are shown here. I'll talk about them in just a second. You're performing this reaction at high temperature, which means you're going to have rearrangements and a whole bunch of oxidations because you're burning in air. And you're doing that, well, very near your face, and then you're inhaling that. The kinds of molecules we're dealing with are those benzene rings I showed, usually multiple of those fused together. And in the presence of oxygen and heat, they oxidize, they get extra oxygens added, and they go from being bad for us, carcinogens, to being really bad for us. Bad carcinogens, mutagens, they interfere with our DNA, etc. Same things happen if we take these in and our body metabolizes them, because these molecules themselves can't stay. They get usually oxygens put on them and then excreted. And in those forms, they're not very good for us either. These kinds of compounds, known as PAHs, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, are found in obviously cigarette smoke, but also even when you cook at high temperatures, for example, in crude oil. It's also true that exposure to these types of compounds during prenatal development impacts IQ of children up to age 5 and possibly beyond. So they're not good for you. Here is THC, tetrahydrocannabinol. How many people have heard of this molecule? All right, probably have. This particular isomer that's shown here is the one found in cannabis, one of several. It's psychoactive, and it produces a variety of other effects, such as can help relieve nausea, good for potentially relieving pain and inflammation, right? We've heard of all of these sorts of things. Like I said, there are others. I want to think about, as an organic chemist, think about the structure of that molecule. We've got a whole bunch of carbons, and two little oxygens. And that means that it's mostly going to be soluble in non-polar environments, by which an analogy would be oil. Okay, so this molecule, we put it in the body, is going to go to things that are oily, not to things that are water. Another way to say that is that it's going to come here. Here's a representation of the cell membrane. It's going to sit preferentially in the non-polar portion of the cell membrane, not out here where there's water, or it not necessarily interact much with these polar headings. So how can we learn a little bit about how molecules like THC impact ion channel function? This is related to my research. I'll just introduce the technique, but you can ask more questions if you want later. The ultimate readout here is a trace that's current as the y-axis, time is the x-axis, and we're interested in how long these activations are. These activations are when two of these molecules come together in equilibrium and form a dimer, and ions pass through this pore. That pore is one that we make when we form a bilayer, cell membrane, of whatever composition we want. We put salt solutions, NaCl on either side, and then we apply voltage, which produces a current to flow. Goes through a bunch of electronics, and then that's the control, and then we add something. We haven't added THC, we could in the future, but we add some molecule represented by this pink thing, and that may change the length of channel duration. Why do we care about the length of channel durations? Well, here's one example of a congenital myasthenic syndrome that produces extreme muscle weaknesses, possibly even problems breathing. A mild example of this is eye drooping. This is caused and related directly at the in-U level in the biological system to, in the wild type, significant channel activation. I just want you to think about this qualitatively. Whereas with the patient who exhibits these sorts of myasthenic syndromes has much less channel activation. So impacting the function of these types of channels can have an impact on us as a whole. An example that we've studied in my lab is looking at indirect impacts of certain drugs. So here's our control trace. Again, all of these sort of upward blips are channel activations. And here's a scale bar. So we're dealing with picoamps, that's 10 to the negative 12 amps. We're measuring tiny electrical currents. And each of these lasts about 1/10 of a second on average. And then we added a drug. I'm not ready to tell you what that drug is yet because we're still doing these experiments. But at a very low concentration, 1 micromolar. Okay, that's 10 to the negative 6 molar. And vocally you can see that those activations got much, much longer. So this drug, without directly binding to anything, indirectly impacted the properties of this artificial cell membrane. This molecule has a phenol, a benzene with an OH, and as THC does, but it's not. In general, most drugs also undergo direct interactions. They're not reactions, but the direct interactions with receptors of various sorts. And they bind different affinities, different levels of tightness, if you will, and produce a variety of different physiological effects. in order for optimal binding to occur, this is a representation of the protein, whatever region of that protein is being bound has to have the right shape, the right three-dimensional shape. So here's one example of a molecule. This is actually smoking cessation drug. That you can see it's flat over here, but it sticks out over here. And the shape of this, for example, would have to be the right fit in order to bind at that receptor. More generically, and receptors, there are thousands, if not tens of thousands of receptors in our body. A given molecule, it's a good drug, will bind one or just a few of those. And it will bind it at very high affinity, so very low concentration. An example receptor is a nicotine acetylcholine receptor. It's a pentamer, so it's 5 subunits. It goes through the cell membrane. And the extracellular domain is where either nicotine or acetylcholine, shown here, this is an endogenous neurotransmitter. This is something that happens when you smoke normal cigarettes, tobacco cigarettes. And here's epibadidine, which also binds these. All of these have one thing in common. They've got a positively charged nitrogen, and that facilitates binding here. The binding happens way on the outside. And these molecules are tiny. This acetylcholine is drawn here, but it's a tiny molecule that causes a major change in these ion channels. And it's because of the high specificity at the receptor binding site and the ability of that molecule to induce a conformational change. Nicotinic receptors are potential therapeutic targets for a variety of diseases and disorders. And so by addressing the binding of either those molecules or the one I showed, which is a smoking cessation drug, varenicline, to these receptors, we have the potential eventually to address this problem. Now, THC also has direct interactions with receptors in our body. The specific receptors are CB1, CB2, and probably some others, but these are the major ones. And these are receptors that are in the class that's known as GPCR, G protein-coupled receptors. They have 7 transmembrane helices. They go back and forth across the membrane. And binding at CB1 and CB2 produces different effects in us. So it's CB1, that receptor specifically, that produces most of the psychotropic effects, central nervous system effects of THC and other cannabinoids. And it's CB2, the other subtype, that produces a lot of the more desirable sorts of effects. It's also true that some cannabinoids can activate at other portions of channels. And it's also true that cannabinoids that are in us themselves, they're called endocannabinoids, activate these molecules. Activate these types of receptors, CB1 and CB2. This one activates mostly CB1. This one does about the same. And a couple more things I want to say. One is about medical marijuana versus synthetic marijuana versus synthetic THC. I think you all have heard of medical marijuana, okay? But in talking about synthetic marijuana, we are talking about structures that are different chemical entities. And they might have different abilities to target, CB1 versus CB2. Yeah, THC itself binds them about equally. When these started coming several years ago, and in the last few years in particular, they've received a lot of press. They're being made by amateurs, sometimes by professionals, but we don't know about their purity, and of course, they've never been tested. And so once they hit the street, in some cases, you might be the first person to ever take that synthetic marijuana, that molecule. On the other hand, synthetic THC is a defined chemical entity. It's veronal, it can be prescribed by a doctor to make exactly that molecule. It's made and can be made in high purity and can be given in different forms, some of which might not have the adverse effects of smoking. People who have taken both this THC by marijuana smoke as well as by these forms sometimes experience the effects differently. If it's vaporized, you get that physiological effect quite quickly and it's of shorter duration. Here are some structures of these synthetic marijuanas. Some of them look quite similar, like the top 3, and some of them look fairly different. And yet they have the same physiologic effect, or at least a very similar one. And that's true broadly of drugs. Sometimes if you change just the three-dimensional shape a little bit, we call those an isomer, you get a very different physiologic effect, sometimes not. But the key point here is that we can't always predict. Not even the biggest, fastest computers used by pharmaceutical companies where billions of dollars are on the line, they can't predict necessarily what a given structure will do in our body. And so we need to actually do the testing. That's my point. If you want to find out what it does in humans, you actually have to check what it does. I'm just going to leave you with this, which is from the Synthetic Drug Abuse Prevention Act of 2012. And what I learned looking through this is that it sort of full-scale bans a bunch of molecules, some of which haven't even been made yet. And so I found that interesting and thought that might be something that you might want to accomplish. So those are the take-home messages again. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sweet.
First of all, I have to tell you, I'm a physician. I practice family medicine, and I also work in emergency rooms. And the first thing I have to tell you is that no pharmaceutical company paid for me to be here, and I haven't been paid for this lecture. I work for the federal government, and so there has been no association between me and this lecture. The second thing I like to tell you is that I see patients every day. I see patients. And I'm also they made me designated for whatever reason, PR person for the VA. Whereas I either speak to one person or I speak to thousands of people. I'm on TV or either I'm in front of a patient. So I'm not used to lecturing, so you all have to bear with me. Which one? I never use one of these. Which way did it? So I'd first like to say how I got interested in this, and one of the ways I got interested was that there's the knowledge that you got from your chemistry professor, and that's what you get the first 2 years of medical school. And then the third and fourth year, you do what's called clinical rotations, and then you do residency. And basically, everybody knows these patients that you see. And then they put you in the real world. And in the real world, you're out there all of a sudden by yourself. These people haven't read the book. These people don't know you. So practicing medicine is very different, a lot of times, than what you've been trained to do. Drugs play a part in taking care of people. It's very important. You don't know who has taken what, and you're trying to treat people not knowing. Drug use is very common. Marijuana use is very common. 160 million people between the ages of 15 and 64 years have been estimated to use cannabis at least once in the past year. The average age of first-time use is 18.8 years. However, the first-time use of drugs is between the ages of 12 to 14. Now, what is a drug? Cigarette, alcohol use, opioids like Vortab, benzodiazepines like Xanax, Valium, Transcend. So a lot of children between the ages of 12 and 14 have use. However, cannabis use tends to be legal. Now, a lot depends on the environment you grow up in. In some environments, cannabis is more accessible. You can go out your door and you can buy cannabis. Whereas when you get older, it may not be as accessible. You may be in a different kind of environment. The other names: marijuana, grass, pot, dope, Mary Jane, push, weed, hash, joints, blue, reefers, cones, smoke, mold, Buddha, ganja, hydro, ganja, heads, greens. Now, my work experience has been very, very broad. I worked in Angola on the weekends, taking care of the inmates in their emergency rooms. It was very surprising. I shouldn't say this, but the illicit drug use inside of the prison. And that was the first time I heard ganja. The ganja man's coming down. I said, what? The ganja man is coming down. And I was like, what is the ganja? And so then they proceeded to tell me it was marijuana. I said, aren't we in a prison? And they said, yeah, but there was illicit drug use in the prison. There was alcohol, and there was also marijuana. So that was the first time I ever heard the term ganja. What is it? It's derived from the dried leaves of cannabis plant, thrives in tropical temperate locations of the world. Used in three main forms: marijuana, hashish, hash oil. It's usually smoked. As I mentioned here, these studies, and that's one of the things I found in my research. All of my information pretty much came from up to date, which is kind of like our Bible. No matter what happens, no matter what you learn here, no matter what you learn in medical school, it all ends up to up to date. So some of these other studies that I read, I just didn't know about because the studies are not controlled. But as mentioned, first-time drug use is very common. In this one study, 14 to 24-year-olds used cannabis 1 to 4 times in their life. 69% stopped. 17 used 1 to 4 more times, 11%, 5 or more times, 2% developed cannabis abuse, 1% developed cannabis dependence. When you speak of drugs, when you speak of marijuana, cannabis, you speak of opioids, heroin, you speak of crack, cocaine, alcohol, tobacco, what determines dependence? Well, it gets into, do you go through withdrawal? For marijuana, for the most part, you don't go through withdrawal. But with heroin, which is also in the group of opioids, which Lortab, Lorcet, Dilaudid, Percodan, oxycodone, these drugs, you actually develop a withdrawal symptoms. Marijuana, you really don't get the withdrawal symptoms. Alcohol, they used to treat alcoholics in the hospital with alcohol when they came in to prevent DTs. You have to withdraw from it. Nicotine, you withdraw from it. Studies have even shown you may withdraw from carbohydrates, which is sugar. But for cannabis, you really don't withdraw. And that's why it's only 1% for dependence. Because basically you can stop. And you don't have to be like hospitalized or have treatment. For what reason do people use cannabis? A mild euphoria, relaxation high, changes in users' mood, thought, and perception of the environment, more intense experience. As a physician, I get these phone calls all the time. How long will it take this to get out of my system? I have to be drug tested. What can you do to help me? And it's hard because I want to help people. I want to assist. I said, if you've been smoking marijuana, there's nothing I can do. If you've been using it chronically for months. I had a patient once, he was in jail, he had to go back and be drug tested, and so he started drinking a lot of tea. He said, well, I'm just going to drink tea till this gets out of my system, since there's no pill you can give me. But that's a question probably that you might encounter from someone you know about when. Urine tests for cannabinoids remain positive after discontinuation of cannabis for up to 7 to 10 days, and a casual cannabis user 2 to 4 weeks, and a heavy user months in a chronic heavy user. Now where I work, we can drug test, and that has been wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And we get some people who come in and they want Lorcet, Lortab, they want some pain medication, or maybe they have an anxiety disorder and they want a benzodiazepine. Well, basically, if their drug test has ever been positive for cannabis, I say no, because I don't know when I'm interacting with what. And if it's on the record, I basically say no unless I have a documented objective finding that you have any pain. If you've had an amputation, yes. If you come in and say your back hurts or your knee hurts, and you have a positive drug test, I say no. So if you're ever applying for a job or anything like that, you really don't want to go in and have a positive drug test. And these are the statistics that you basically want to know. If you're applying to go into the military, they even ask you, have you ever had a history of illicit drug use? You say no, and they go pull a drug screen. Now, I will tell you, if you go in the hospital or ever in an emergency room or in a clinic, and they really don't use that against you, like if you need it to treat. I was working in an emergency room in rural Louisiana, and I had a patient that came in at 3 o'clock in the morning and was in the tree and wouldn't get out the tree. And so his friends, they were like, get out the tree, get out the tree, get out the tree. So he jumped and he fractured his arm. He had a humeral fracture. So I'm like, what have you taken? And he refused to tell me. And the reason that he refused to tell me, I guess he thought I was going to call the police or something. But in that case, it wouldn't be used against you. But for the most part, if you're for work reasons or for military reasons, it's really not a good idea to have a history of illicit drug use and have it documented. Cannabis use disorder. This is kind of, cannabis is in a class all by itself. Because like I said, you don't withdraw from it. Alcohol, well, how do you define an alcoholic? Do you drink before 12 o'clock? Have you gotten a DUI? Do you feel like you need to quit? Do you feel guilty? It's like using the money. And that tells us pretty much, that answers the alcohol question. Tobacco users. What are some of the symptoms you have? But cannabis use disorder is really kind of it's been kind of difficult to define because you don't have the, like I mentioned, you don't have the withdrawal hormone. That is a repeated pattern of use, intoxication that develops over an extended period of time. What are some of the reasons people use it? To improve their social skills, to improve the social support and interpersonal functioning, to manage painful feelings, enhance motivation. What does it do to a family? It's really difficult talking to someone who's continuously high, for one thing. And so it can impair a family. Dependency on marijuana often causes a disconnect from the rest of the person. Family often enables the use to continue his or her dependence without realization. And dependence on any drug is family disease. Since you're students, what do I tell my patients? I tell my patients, if you think of a bell-shaped curve, and you can think of stress and anxiety on the x-axis, and you can think of performance on the y-axis. This is like this. We all have to go through stress and anxiety to perform whatever we want. Stress is normal. Anxiety is normal. However, if you have no stress, you have no performance. And so what does marijuana do? It reduces your stress. So what does it do to your performance? You get nowhere. And that's why you're still on the couch. What happens if you have too much anxiety? If you have too much anxiety, that's the person, oh, I have to do that. I can't make it. I got to get there on time. I'm late. I've got to do this. And so what happens to your performance? It's bad. So what's the best performances in between? You have to have stress. You have to have anxiety to perform. And you want to fit right in the middle. And that's why illicit drug use is bad. Okay, here's one slide that I want to show you. And psychotic disorders, it brings on schizophrenia earlier if you're predisposed to schizophrenia. And schizophrenia is mental illness, and the roots, autism is association, dental disease, the four components. The DEA, marijuana remains a Schedule I substance under the Controlled Substance Act, which defines it as a substance with no recognized medical use for a high risk of dependency and thus illegal to use and distribute. I'm a member of the American Medical Association. It opposes legalization of marijuana and has called the federal approach to reducing the drug's use ineffective. Cannabis is a dangerous drug and as such is a public health concern.
Thank you, Dr.
Feel free to use the microphone.
Okay.
Thank you.
My top hat and cane are back in my office. Dr. White was supposed to bring the replacement. Anyway, thanks for inviting me. Pleased to be here. Thanks to all of you for coming. Similar to the other two presentations, I want to focus on information that I think needs to be part of the debate about marijuana and other drugs as we consider this politically and socially. So, a little bit of history. Marijuana, like many of today's illegal drugs, used to be legal in the U.S. early 20th century. Marijuana was legal, heroin was legal. Buy heroin over the counter. And in early 20th century, the largest demographic group who used heroin were white middle-class housewives. And so they would get their husbands off to work, their kids off to school, and then they'd stop by the pharmacy. And that changed 1920s, somewhere in there. A couple of things came together. We saw the early formation of what was then called the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, which was a precursor to current DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency. And they were pretty active in determining what the legal status of drugs. And there were a number of campaigns that highlighted the dangers of drugs. There's no doubt, as the information you've already heard, that marijuana, like tobacco, alcohol, and a variety of other things, some legal, have negative effects. Drugs do. We all know the food we eat has effects. Bacon cheeseburgers are wonderful. When we eat them, we know we're not doing our bodies any favor. But what happened historically in the early 20th century was that political campaigns, social campaigns, interest groups began highlighting the dangers. And probably the stereotypical one that applies to marijuana, movie that many of you I'm sure heard of or have seen, Reefer Madness, where groups of people got together, got high, and turned into homicidal maniacs and sex fiends. And let me say, from a sociological perspective, this is a very common sort of process. If we get these sorts of campaigns, and it elicits a social reaction. And very often, what sociologists and social scientists refer to as a moral panic. That you see this highlighted danger, highlighted problems. Marijuana at the time was a lot associated with jazz musicians, which were seen as not really part of society. And so it took on this whole aura of harmful effects, and the upshot of that historically was that marijuana ended up getting classified in the same schedule as other drugs, heroin, other drugs that were physically addictive. Well, we've heard marijuana is not. That you can develop a psychological dependency, and that some people do get habitually used to using it a lot form. And there's been lots of discussion about whether marijuana belongs in that schedule. The fact of the matter is that it is there. So it gets treated legally the same. Once that happened, then we saw a whole series of laws develop over the next several decades. And they all flowed from the way drugs were classified, and by the federal government, by the Bureau of the NDD, Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. And several things came up, not simultaneously, but sequentially. We saw the advent of mandatory minimum sentences, where people with a certain number of offenses or a certain type of offense would get a mandatory minimum sentence that they had to use. We also saw things like three strikes you're out laws, where upon conviction of each time we were convicted of a certain class of crimes or penalties got progressively more severe. And one of the end results of those kinds of laws, mandatory minimums, three strikes you're out, and it was defined for drugs in this case, if that's what we're talking about, really fueled part of the prison expansion. And so now we have, depending on where you look, if you look across the country, we have local jails, state prisons, federal prisons. Somewhere around 30% or so of the people who are incarcerated are there for possession offenses, not for dealing or importation, but for the possession of drugs of some sort, including marijuana. Many people believe that that is a mistake. You end up taking people who are essentially nonviolent and putting them in prisons with violent habitual offenders. And it's very expensive. It's somewhere up around $40,000 a year now to incarcerate someone. So we end up with a boom in prison population. Cost us a lot of money. And one thing we know about drug treatment in prison, regardless of the drug, is it just doesn't work. The best predictor of whether an inmate gets drug treatment when incarcerated is how close they are to release. So the idea that someone goes in and then they're there for 5, 10, 15 years and they go through long-term treatment is not true. There's budget constraints and staffing and all those things. What happens is inmates closest to release are the ones who get in treatment, and the evaluations of those programs are rather dismal in terms of reoffending. And then the other effect of that is for people who are incarcerated for these possession offenses. Now, upon release, have all the problems we know that released prisoners have in terms of reintegrating into society, getting jobs, and trying to get back into a normal social life. The association of crime and violence with marijuana is almost zero in terms of people who get high and then commit other kinds of crimes, in particular serious violent crimes. It doesn't seem to have that effect. That's also true for other kinds of drugs too. Heroin use, for example, is not that closely related to violent behavior, or even other kinds of crimes. The best estimates we have of people who are addicted to drugs of some sort, physically addicted, is that they account for maybe 1 out of every 5 or 6 serious crimes that occur. So this image that heroin addicts are stealing a lot and holding up people in order to get the money to feed their habit has not been borne out by the research. Some of the early research on marijuana also tagged it as a gateway drug, the idea that starting with marijuana then leads to other kinds of drugs. All those studies have been pretty fairly reviewed and rejected. They were all retrospective, so if they looked at current heroin addicts and said, what did you start with? Many of them said marijuana. But then when we were able to do prospective studies, and that is follow people longitudinally, it turned out that most people who experiment and use marijuana don't go on to harder drugs. There's a lot more that I can say, just as my colleagues and say those for discussion. The last thing I would say is that there's no doubt smoking pot has negative effects. It's not good for you. I would suggest, however, that cranking up the entire criminal justice and legal system as a way to deal with it is misguided. It's not going to hit the problem. It's enormously expensive, even more expensive than treatment. So let me leave it there, and we, after the last presentation, we can deal with some of the details and discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Capowich. So our next presenter is Dr. Mark Thornton, who is Skyping to us, and we're going to get this technology work out here, and we'll be ready to go.
Okay, are we ready to go?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Well, it's a pleasure for me to be here with you today, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here via Skype. I love Loyola. I went to St. Bonaventure University, which is also Catholic, and our sports mascot is also the wolf. And of course, I love New Orleans as well. And Loyola has in my opinion, has one of the best undergraduate economics departments in the country. So it really is great to be here with you tonight. on this topic, which I think is very, very important because all indications are that marijuana is going to be increasingly legalized around the country for both medical and recreational uses. And this is a pattern that's existing not just in the United States, but it's also emerging around the world. So we need information about this topic in terms of dealing with it, because demographically and politically, we're moving in this direction, and my point of view is that that's a good thing. The issue of the origin of marijuana prohibition is an interesting one because it's sort of dark and mysterious. It was previously mentioned about the movie Reefer Madness, but that was a movie, a propaganda movie that was made by the government itself. There was no actual significant social uproar about marijuana in the United States in 1937, when marijuana was effectively prohibited by a tax. They enacted the Marijuana Tax Act. And when they had hearings before Congress, there was no really negative statements made except by the government itself. And actually at that time, the American Medical Association spoke out against the Marijuana Tax Act and prohibition because it was a legitimate medical resource that doctors used and that veterinarians used in particular in their practices on a regular basis. My father was a pharmacist, and he had antique glass jars that said cannabis sativa and cannabis indica, which are two of the main forms of marijuana. So it was a very legitimate, useful product. And that's where I'd like to start my presentation, with the distinction between the sort of legitimate uses and the illegitimate uses, where the legitimate uses are to both marijuana and hemp. Both products are cannabis products, and both were effectively illegal by the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. Prior to this, hemp and marijuana were a very important resource in the economy. Columbus used hemp-produced sails and ropes in order to get from the old world to the new world. Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence on paper that was made from hemp. And so this was a very important product. Humans have been using it for over 5,000 years for a variety of purposes. And I'll list out some of those. Hemp and marijuana can be used for things like sails and ropes of all sorts. It can be used as food, protein powder. It can be used as fuel. It can be used as biodegradable plastics. And so it has a whole lot of commercial purposes that it can be used for. There are a lot of medical uses for marijuana and hemp, and studies have been just released within the last couple of years which indicate the strong possibility that, of course, marijuana is used for glaucoma, pain relief, anxiety, eating disorders, all sorts of medical uses in hemp, in the cannabinoid CBD. The evidence indicates the possibility that it can be used to shrink and eliminate brain tumors in children, and it reduces or eliminates epileptic seizures in children, and also eliminates a couple of different types of leukemia cancer in the blood. And the research is really just starting here, and most of the government research money, of course, has been for years used to try to determine negative consequences for marijuana consumption, and almost none have been looking at the possible benefits of medical marijuana, which are significant both for the THC version and the CBD version. And so there's a whole host of legitimate uses that would be very beneficial for the economy. Most of my research, however, has been directed towards the illegitimate or recreational uses of marijuana. And basically, of course, we know full well that there's a lot of people who are smoking pot in various forms out there. And one of the things that I've been able to show with my research is really the exact opposite of this notion that you start with marijuana and you use it as a gateway drug to more powerful and more potent and more dangerous and addictive drugs up to heroin. And what I've shown is that the more the government enforces prohibition, the more resources they allocate in terms of law enforcement, the military and so forth, the greater the penalties, the greater the fines, all of that encourages the smugglers to bring in the easily concealed, more potent versions of drugs. And so when it started out in the 1960s and 70s is that marijuana became much, much more potent. And between the early 70s and the early 80s, the potency of marijuana during that phase of the war on drugs went from 0.5% to 5%. And of course now it's even much more potent because smugglers and dealers are encouraged to condense these drugs into the smallest possible package. And when it was difficult to condense marijuana into a smaller package, smugglers from South America and Mexico switched to things like cocaine, and then crack, and then heroin, and then of course in more recent years crystal meth, which is produced locally, so you avoid, the Coast Guard and the border guards and all that. You only have to avoid the local sheriff and police. And then of course now, drugs are coming in from around the world that are made chemically, where they tweak the molecules that the other people were talking about, the other speakers, and they essentially, avoid detection that way. And when people who use those new synthetic drugs show up at the emergency room, there's no effective test to determine what they've taken and how strong of a dose they've taken. And so the war on drugs has actually made drug use much, much more dangerous, more potent, more dangerous, more addictive. And we've seen the number of emergency room visits and overdose deaths escalate and then bump over into the legal prescription drugs where Oxycontin and Vicodin are now killing more people than heroin and cocaine. So this whole notion that the war on drugs is going to make us healthier is just completely wrong. The whole idea that the war on drugs is going to make us safer by eliminating crime is just ridiculous, because what we've seen is these drug dealers, these cocaine cartels, the street gangs that distribute drugs at the consumer level are all one of the most major sorts of violence in society. And it's not that we haven't tried drug prohibition or that we haven't taken different approaches to the war on drugs, or that we haven't arrested enough people or confiscated enough drugs. The police and law enforcement have been incredibly successful in catching people, of confiscating drugs, of doing all that. But that's the problem, is that the more they do that, the more the dealers and smugglers have to turn to increasingly concentrated, dangerous forms of drugs. And the outcome of their success of arresting people is that they're destroying lives in the process. They're separating families, they're putting breadwinners in jail, they're breaking up families. When you get arrested for possession, you may end up in jail, you may end up in prison, but even if you don't, you've got a record, and you're going to have a hard time getting a job. You're not going to be able to get student loans, and so it's very disruptive. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people every year that get arrested for the possession of marijuana. And this is all very much to the negative. Not only does it take people out of the workforce and take people out of the family, but it also ends up saddling the taxpayer with a huge bill to support those people in prison. And in the process, this war on drugs has been a major detriment to our civil liabilities.
Dr. Thornton, you have one more minute.
Okay, great. The government's military is not supposed to be involved in police actions, but they are. The government is not really supposed to be able to search with people without a valid warrant, but they do. There's a whole host of legal liabilities that the drug war has foisted upon us. So not only are we less wealthy, less safe, and less healthy, but we're less American as a result. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thornton. So we have time for some questions here. You can either come down here or you can ask them from your location, but please be vocal with that.
Dr. Thornton, how is the view from Randall?
Just fine, thank you.
Questions?
Comments?
Yes.
Yeah, I had a question. I don't know your name, I'm sorry.
Sweet, really, S-W-E-E-T.
Dr. Sweet.
Dr. Sweet. Okay. I guess my question is, you ended your lecture saying that weed is dangerous. However, weed has never killed anybody, yet the FDA has approved several drugs that have killed individuals.
Okay.
I have one more. So, another thing I have is, you say that marijuana ruins families, but, because they're high or whatnot, but at least they're there with their family. But if these drugs are illegal, these people get kidnapped and they get thrown in a cage. So,
You have a question?
I guess I'm showing you that it's better that if they're high and there, rather than if they're in jail. And then I guess, how do you account for the FDA approving drugs that do kill people?
Got it?
First of all, these are, basically as a physician, it's very difficult. I really don't have any feeling one way or another. However, the American Medical Association, their stance is that cannabis is a dangerous drug and as such is a public health concern. The American Medical Association opposes the legalization of marijuana and has called the federal approach to reducing the drug use ineffective. And that's as of today, 2013. Now that might change. One of the issues is that there really hasn't been enough research done. When you look at the medical benefits, everyone runs to glaucoma. Glaucoma is the increase of the intraocular pressure in your eye that can cause blindness. And what it's shown is that, yes, it can decrease it for that period of time. But does it decrease it long term? So is it really effective? You treat glaucoma with some ophthalmic solutions. So if you smoke marijuana right now, it decreases it. But you haven't cured it. The other thing about pain, if you smoke marijuana for pain, you still have pain when you stop smoking it. So if you have back pain, what you need is an anti-inflammatory, like people use opioids for pain. Well, you still haven't gotten rid of the pain. So you're going to smoke marijuana the rest of your life, basically, to take care of pain that you can get rid of. And as far as families, that was from up to date. Up to date, if you ever go to medical school, it's kind of like what we use as of 2014. And up to date, that's what they said. It's not what I said. And basically, in my experience, being a physician and seeing patients every day, I have not seen any family benefit from anyone smoking marijuana. I mean, it's just not what I see. I had a patient, I said, would you please come back not having smoked up? I don't know what you're talking about. I mean, I just don't see it. I also see other things with marijuana. There's the question of HIV. There have been so many, when I've seen my patients that are HIV positive, a number of them use marijuana. And it impairs your decisions. The things that you would do high, you don't do when you're not high. You just don't. And so you may have the tendency. There's also been when you speak of drug dealers and you speak of crime, it's going to take a college degree, a 1 year of college to empty the trash bin. So if you legalize marijuana, the people who are dealing with drugs on the street are going to have a high school diploma. They're going to have to be educated to have a license to do what they've been doing. So they're just going to sell. They're not going to have jobs. They're going to have, so the whole process basically has not been researched enough. And I think that's the issue with the government, is that we need more time. Now, let me say one other thing. I tell my patients all the time, a lot of people don't want to take medication. And I say, if the United States has approved it, for the most part, it's good. Where I work, we have a formulator. And I usually do not prescribe a medication that has not been on the market for 3 years. And I tell them, they say, I want to go take some herbs for this. If you take theophylline is a bronchodilator. And it expands your lungs so you can breathe in. This has been studied. When Europeans came over here with Native Americans and they got digoxin, which is a plant that increases the contractility of the heart, basically, I think no one is like saying marijuana is that, but we just haven't had enough research. And when you look at the epilepsy, there's one on CNN about the little girl who had the seizures. It stops the seizures at that point in time. It does all that for that point, but it doesn't cure it. As far as, and maybe there have been some brain tumors or whatever. I just don't think that there's been enough research.
Thank you, Jeff. Next question. Yes, sir, back there.
There are there are other countries, especially like in the European region and like areas such as Amsterdam, that have really no restraints against marijuana, and they're like receiving a lot of like economic prosperity, putting a lot towards their money, towards their schools and like other economic regions. Don't you kind of feel that like, especially since like hemp is used for a lot of its fibers to make plastics, and used to make milks and they're actually like
There's actually an architectural company that actually has made houses out of hemp. So don't you feel that if anything, aside from really protecting people, it's more doing so harm? Because you could economically receive a lot of benefits from this, and also like we would stop a lot of this war on drugs because there wouldn't necessarily be too much of a blockade on this, and it wouldn't necessarily be funding it. Like all these drug cartels and things of that nature, because we would have a legalization of the drug within our country.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm saying, like, don't you think that, like, if anything, all these prohibitions and laws against marijuana are actually doing more harm than good?
Okay. Who would you like to answer? Who are you directing your question?
Everyone, if they can answer, if they have any sort of
Who would like to
input on
answer
this.
Well, in response to your comment about, and Dr. Thornton's comment about the effects of the drug war on drugs, the metaphor, the research on that has been, as Dr. Thornton said, it hasn't been effective. It hasn't stemmed the flow of drugs. It hasn't reduced demand. And it has pushed not only concentration of marijuana, but then pushed dealing into more dangerous drugs. And I think, the AMA conclusions aside, as I said in my comments, there are negative effects from smoking marijuana. But to lump it in with these other drugs, I don't understand. I don't know what the AMA is thinking when to say that even if it doesn't have medical uses, because Dr. Sweet's right, we always need more research, although I would argue that we always want to go with the best information we have at the time, and then that changes. But to lump it all together and to say that it's a high probability of addiction when addiction to marijuana is also occurring just doesn't make any sense.
You mentioned, I just think it's more research for a public health concern. And I want to say, in 1920, Coca-Cola was established in Vicksburg, Mississippi. And cocaine was in Coca-Cola. And so we did make it legal for everybody just to use. And like I said, I just think it just needs to be more research. Just like cocaine, if they had made it legal, what would have happened to the country at that point in time?
This gentleman back here.
My question is, why hasn't the AMA advocated for outlawing cigarettes or drinking or other? Why hasn't the AMA advocated for banning cigarette smoking use, tobacco use, or alcoholic use, since we know how harmful these substances are also to the public and to the people that use them?
who are you directing?
I'm sorry, to the doctor on the left. I'm
Dr. Sweet.
Yes.
I don't know. I'd have to research it. I do know that the AMA does oppose alcohol dependency and tobacco use. I think it's just the question is where do we go from here? And at this point in time with marijuana, that's already part of our society.
Let me get this gentleman, and I'll come back to this lady over here.
Okay, this is towards Dr. Shanata. So the gentleman in the back or on Skype was stating that they are increasing concentration, make it smaller, and I'm just wondering, since it's a plant or a herb type product, how do you increase the concentration without like destroying the chemical makeup or anything?
Wait, so you're asking him how to increase the concentration?
Yeah, how is the concentration increased?
Okay.
Like, do they, because isn't it just a herb that you put in, you know, I don't know much about it.
So I don't know the answer to that question. I would guess that it's like
Is that directed to me? Basically, they increase the potency of marijuana by growing it differently, and also by altering the growing conditions. And during the initial phases of the war on drugs, growers were eventually able to catch on to the idea that what they wanted to do was increase the potency of the THC and reduce the CBD. And the CBD cannabinoid sort of mellows the effect of the THC, but it's the THC that's where the money's at. And so if you grow plants differently, if you genetically engineer them, if you grow them indoors, hydroponically, and if you process the plants so that you're only processing the buds of the plants, the flowering buds that have not been seminated, then you're going to get the highest possible potency of marijuana. So it's through growing conditions, genetic engineering, and also processing. When in the 1960s, the marijuana from Mexico that was brought in, you know, they would bring in the flowers and the leaves, all the stems and seeds that you don't need. I guess nobody got that. And so, you know, they're able to process this. But I'd like to say that all drugs are dangerous, and all drugs are potentially lethal. And one drug that's recently come on the market is a synthetic, almost plastic-like paper that's 100% pure THC, and they found that causes some severe reactions and has resulted in numerous emergency room visits as a consequence. And typically, you know, nobody's died from marijuana. Typically, nobody shows up at the emergency room with just marijuana in their system. It's usually marijuana and cocaine and some other things, alcohol. But for the first time ever, people have been showing up at the emergency room with just marijuana, THC in their bloodstream because it's become that potent of a product that's come onto the market, because you can literally in the size of a computer notebook carry the same effective amount of THC that would take a small truck to carry from the 1960s. So all drugs are dangerous. No drugs are safe under all conditions. What economists have been finding, though, is that when you decriminalize and legalize marijuana and people switch to marijuana from things like alcohol, that you get at least small reductions in crime, you get small reductions in violence, because marijuana doesn't incite violence the way alcohol does, and you get fewer traffic deaths because people who smoke marijuana tend to drive very slow and safely.
Thank you, Dr. Thornton.
Not safe, not safe.
Thank you, sir. Let's get this lady back.
I wanted to ask the doctor of chemistry if you could speak to differing effects on the adolescent brain. My understanding is that marijuana affects, the brain at different stages of development.
Yeah, so I don't know that much about it. Maybe Dr. Sweet does, but that's absolutely true. One thing that she mentioned that I had heard before is that it can bring on schizophrenia at an earlier age.
So just to clarify the question for everybody, your question is, does the use of THC affect the structure of the brain?
Yeah, how does it affects the adolescent brain differently, and how do you describe those effects?
So, and the other thing that I can say is that the receptors that are present, so the ion channels that are present both in our brain and throughout our body, change over time. Those that are present earlier, so from birth up through adolescence until our brain is fully formed, are ones that are certainly differentially effective. I can't say definitively if it would be if THC, for example, is more or less potent. I don't know if that study's been done. So yeah, I don't know if we know if it's a higher or lower amount causes the same, either therapeutic or deleterious effect.
Dr. Sweet.
It affects the hippocampus of the brain and the amygdala, and it affects, which belongs to the limbic system, and it affects the short-term memory, spatial navigation, and really with memory and cognitive skills. The big thing that studies have shown is that the earlier you use, the more likely you're going to use later. You're more likely to use. And so it may affect, one thing I work for the federal government, we have to have adjustment. And so you become dependent on a chemical to adjust. And so even though it may not structurally, it's psychologically, because you're unable to adjust like someone who has not been using chemicals to adjust at an earlier age.
Let's get this lady right here.
Yeah, my question is to Dr. Shanata. You spoke of like widening the ion channel, is that correct? Or
Yeah, so lengthening the time to stay.
okay, do you know exactly what like that does physically to a person, or is that like you said, not been like further studied yet?
We don't know as a function of which receptor it happens to. There are thousands or tens of thousands of different receptors. So one I showed, myasthenic syndrome, when that's less active, you get problems with muscle control. With other receptors, if it was more active, you might have it. So I guess the key difference is that you've got specific effects when for example, THC binds CB1 or CB2. And you've got non-specific effects when it gets into some brains. And I guess my point would be we should study both of those and get a whole picture.
So I think we have time for about 2 more questions. Here, let's get this lady right here and then these gentlemen.
As like a doctor of chemistry, how do you feel about particular sets of molecules being outlawed? Like especially, organic ones.
I was very disturbed to learn, although in a little bit further research about this 2012. Okay. But apparently in 1986, there was an analog law passed and signed. And so but it just wasn't fully implemented. People didn't have the, wherewithal to go forward and say, well, okay, any analog of any structurally similar molecule that theoretically we could say is illegal. The idea of making a molecule illegal before it even exists is truly great.
This gentleman, you get the last question.
Dr. Thornton, I don't think you're this for you. I understand your affinity may not be towards taxation, but I'm curious what are the possible average tax revenues that places who do legalize marijuana would be expected to have, like Colorado or
Well, they repealed prohibition largely because alcohol prohibition because tax revenues were so low, and alcohol taxes were the major source of revenue for the federal, state, and local governments. And in 1933, they just didn't have the revenue to maintain government, and so those alcohol taxes were a great lure because you can raise the taxes significantly for the government and yet reduce the price to the consumer. So legalization is, in that sense, a good bargain for both of the parties. And I think with marijuana prohibition, the revenue potential is not great, but it's still significant. The city of Philadelphia turned marijuana possession from a crime to a misdemeanor, subject to, I think, a $100 fine. They saved $2 million in prosecution and law enforcement costs within the first 6 months. And of course, Colorado, one of the big things now is they've got more revenue than they expected, and the battle is to who's going to get the money to spend it. So I think it's tangible that the money is realistically somewhat significant, but I don't think it's going to cure the national debt or reduce eliminate the national deficit or anything like that. But, I would like to see marijuana especially brought back just into regular commerce and subject to just regular regulation and taxation. But I must admit that while it's not my preference, heavy excise taxes could do a great deal of benefit for government finance, particularly at the local level, because they also bear a significant burden of the cost. So they'd be reducing cost while increasing revenue at the same time.
Well, I think on that very clear and coherent note, we can give all our panel a great round of applause. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Thank you, Dr. Thornton.
Thank you very much. We'll walk back.
Thank you for coming. I'm so sorry about the technical difficulties.
Pretty smooth by standards.
Really? Really? Okay. That makes everything better. Have a good night, okay?
Take care, everyone.
And that test started, so. Yeah. Like, I've learned that. Did you finish the last two questions?
I did them, but I don't know.
Can you send me a picture of them?
I'm gonna go to the library. You wanna check them?
I have to work with Charlie on the lab report.
Oh, hold on.
We did turn on our lab report. Tonight is kind of crazy. I have to go to RJ and I have a fraternity meeting and I have physics lab, so I just need to see what it is. Most of the locations inside the matrix or the cytosol.
I put a lot of
Matrix? Okay.
It's a panel of scientists. Yes, ultimately they make a recommendation to secure but it's really when they start making decisions that, like the number one ranked proposal, that would be a principle. I mean, that would
I managed to cross that. Because it's the
You can tell what she actually got. It's just, yeah, it's like, the AMA says. And be curious, right? But very clear, I don't think we need to cure that.
Thank you so much for your You know, we have. Yeah, I always.
Highly recommend that.
Otherwise, you get a